just been going through the motions. I'm a healthcare provider, so I talk about grief a lot. And now to be on the other side of this is, it's a lot. This loss, this grief, this pain, it's different. It's insurmountable. And I feel like I can't breathe, and I feel like there is an elephant just sitting on my chest. But, I know this is the process. I have a wonderful support system. I have my faith in God, which I've been leaning heavy into. And I know if Nolan was here, he'd be like, Mom, just keep talking to the people, keep telling my story, keep telling your story. So that is going to be my plan. Again, thank you all so much. I love you.
We will have a mutual inspection of the cell phone with our experts and their experts.
There is a phone somewhere in Mississippi that knows what happened to Nolan Wells. It knows where he was in the hours nobody can account for. It knows who he spoke to. It knows whether the story his friends have told the world matches the digital trail he left behind without ever meaning to. It sat in his pocket. It sat in his hand. It went out on that water with him, and unlike Nolan, it came back. And tonight, weeks into a case that has swallowed an entire family's life, nobody watching from the outside can say with certainty that anyone has properly looked at it. Think about what that means for a mother. She has buried her 18-year-old son. She has been called uncooperative on national television. She has watched strangers argue about her child on cable news panels, while the one object capable of ending the argument sits in a drawer, or a safe, or an evidence bag, waiting for a forensic examination that may or may not have ever happened. She is not asking for a theory. She is asking for a record. This is the story of how a single missing forensic report turned a grieving family into suspects, turned a group of teenagers into a hardened legal front, and turned an entire online community into amateur detectives armed with satellite imagery and boat catalogs. Stay with me. Every minute of this one matters. Understand what a phone is now, because the entire case turns on it. An aircraft carries a flight recorder that survives the crash. It logs altitude, heading, airspeed, and cockpit audio, continuously, without permission, without pause. Investigators pull it from the wreckage before they interview a single person, because human memory is negotiable and the recorder is not. Everyone reading this carries one. Most people have no idea what theirs holds. Location services write a position log in the background, whether the screen is on or off, whether the owner is awake or unconscious, whether the phone is being used or sitting on a boat seat in the sun. Messages are stamped to the second on both ends of the conversation. Photographs carry embedded metadata recording the exact moment the shutter fired and the coordinates where the device was standing when it did. Application logs show what was opened, when, and for how long. Cloud synchronization creates a second copy of much of it, held on a server the person holding the phone never touches. And then there is the part nobody outside forensics fully understands. When you delete something on a modern device, the data does not evaporate. The system marks the space it occupies as available and removes the pointer that made it visible to you. The information itself remains until something else physically overwrites it. Deletion makes data harder to find. It does not make it gone, which means a complete extraction of Nolan Wells's phone could answer 4 questions that months of statements, interviews, and press conferences have not touched. Where he was during the hours nobody can account for, who he was in contact with, and when it stopped, what disappeared from his accounts, and at what hour, and whether the story his friends have told the world matches the record his own device kept without asking him. 4 answers, 1 object. 2 entirely different accounts of where that object has been. The attorney representing the young men who were on Horn Island with Nolan has been direct about this in public. His clients, he says, had no reason to touch that phone beyond one thing: returning it to Nolan's mother the same night. Not hold it, not examine it, not clear anything from it. Hand it back. And the claim circulating online that messages or Snapchat activity went missing from the device, he has called that false. That is a confident statement. Hold on to how confident it is, because it becomes the problem. Running against it is a second account, repeated across commentary following this case, that the family has not fully surrendered the device, and that as of recent statements, investigators themselves do not have complete access to what is on it. Now put those two positions side by side and look at what happens. If no complete forensic examination has been performed by anyone, then no one is in a position to say what is or is not missing from that phone. Not the family, not the commentators, and not the attorney. You cannot confirm the absence of deletion on a device that has not been forensically imaged. That is not an accusation. It is a technical impossibility. The only method capable of establishing whether data was removed is the exact method everyone involved appears to agree has not yet happened. Which means one of two things is true. Either that examination has occurred and the public has been told nothing about who conducted it or under what conditions, or a claim of certainty is being made in front of cameras that no available evidence can support. Both statements cannot stand, and underneath that contradiction sits the piece that keeps getting crushed flat every time this case reaches a cable news panel. The family's position, as stated through their own representatives, has never been that no one may examine the phone. It is that the examination should be joint. Forensic professionals representing both sides, potentially federal investigators, an agreed, documented protocol governing how the device is handled, imaged, and interpreted, established before anyone powers it on. That is not obstruction. That is chain of custody, refusing to surrender an object unconditionally and refusing to allow any examination of it are not the same act, and the distance between them is where this family's reputation has been dismantled in public. Ask why a mother who believes her son died under suspicious circumstances would want the most important object in the case, handled with documented safeguards, verified custody, and independent oversight, rather than handed over quietly to a county office in a region where certain families and certain badges have known each other for generations. Framed honestly, that instinct is not guilt, it is arithmetic. If this is the level of detail you want on this case, subscribe, because the rest of this only gets harder to explain away. Because there is a legal instrument built for exactly this standoff. It has existed for over a century. It does not require the family's permission, the attorney's cooperation, or a single press conference. And as far as the public record shows, nobody has used it. There is a document that ends this entire standoff. It fits on one page. A subpoena duces tecum is an order compelling a person to produce a physical thing. Not to testify, not to answer questions, to hand over the object. It has existed in American courts since before Mississippi was a state, and it exists precisely because investigations cannot be allowed to stall on the goodwill of the people holding the evidence. If the Jackson County Sheriff's Office believes Nolan Wells's phone contains material evidence, and if cooperation has genuinely broken down, the remedy is not a statement to a reporter. It is a warrant. It is a subpoena. It is a judge's signature on an order that does not care what anyone's attorney said on television. Nothing on the public record indicates that step has been taken. Sit with what that means, because it forks into exactly two directions, and both of them matter. Either negotiations between the family and investigators are further along than the public shouting match suggests, and the protocol is being worked out quietly while everyone argues over a problem that is already being solved. Or the urgency being performed in press statements does not match the urgency being applied inside the institution that actually has the power to compel. One of those is true. From the outside, there is no way to determine which. That is the failure here. Not corruption, not conspiracy, but a case of national significance in which the most basic procedural question, whether a legal order was issued for the central piece of evidence, is being litigated by inference. The public is reduced to reading tone, counting the days, and guessing at what a county office has or has not filed. Court records exist so that people do not have to guess, and while the lawyers traded statements about what the phone does and does not contain, one person had already looked at it. Before this became a legal dispute, it was a mother scrolling. According to accounts connected to the case, Nolan's family went through his phone and found something that stopped them. Not a message, not a photograph, an absence. The ordinary digital noise of an 18-year-old's day, the Snapchat activity, the pictures, the constant low-level traffic that follows a teenager everywhere, thinned out across the exact window that mattered most. Understand the specificity of what she was doing. A mother does not need forensic training to know her own son's rhythm. She knows how often he posts. She knows what he photographs and what he ignores. She knows that a day on the water with friends produces evidence of itself, dozens of times over, without anyone deciding to document anything. She went looking for the loudest hours of his last day and found them quiet. That observation is the origin of everything that has happened since. Every press statement, every accusation of obstruction, every panel argument traces back to a woman holding her dead son's phone and noticing that the record did not look the way his life looked. And here is the hard part, the part that cuts against the family as much as it cuts for them. What she did cannot answer the question she raised. Opening a camera roll shows you what the operating system chooses to display. Scrolling an app shows you what that app has decided to keep visible. Neither reaches the layer where the answer actually lives, the underlying databases, the application caches, the synchronization logs that record what a device sent to a server and when, the residue of files whose pointers were removed but whose data was never overwritten. A user sees the surface. Deletion happens underneath it. So the family found the question. They could not find the answer, and neither can anyone else without the examination that has not happened. Which raises something almost nobody arguing about this phone seems willing to consider. Everyone treats this examination as a threat. It is being fought over as though the only possible result is exposure, as though forensics is a weapon aimed in one direction. That is backwards. Run the outcomes honestly. Suppose the extraction shows the missing activity was never there. Suppose Nolan simply was not posting that day, or was using an account nobody has thought to check, or had a phone sitting at 8% battery in a dry bag for 6 hours. That result would collapse the single largest pillar of public suspicion in this case. It would hand the young men on that island something no attorney can manufacture and no press conference can buy. Not a denial, documentation. Suppose instead the extraction confirms deletion. The conversation does not end there. It sharpens. When was the data removed, measured to the second? From which device, because a deletion executed from a phone in a police property room is a different event from one executed from a laptop in another county? Was it manual, or was it the application clearing its own cache on a retention schedule it was always going to run, regardless of what happened on the water? Every one of those has a discoverable answer sitting in the same extraction. Same logic on location. If the phone's position log tracks the account the friend group has given, that account hardens into something checkable. If it places Nolan somewhere the story does not, that is not a theory anymore. That is a coordinate with a timestamp, same logic on messages. Confirmation is not a wasted result. A verified timeline is worth more than an unchallenged one, because an unchallenged one can be dismantled by the next person with a screenshot and a following. This is what forensic evidence is for. Not to prove the thing you already believe, to submit every competing version of that day to something that has no preference about which one survives. The phone does not need a spokesperson. It has no last name in Jackson County, no political history, no attorney positioning it for a jury pool. It cannot be intimidated, and it cannot be flattered. It is the only participant in this case with nothing to protect, which is why the parts of the story that came from people, rather than from data, have started coming apart. 3 boats went out that day. A Triton, a smaller Palm Beach, and a boat belonging to a friend referred to in the public accounts as Bart. The version given by Warren, one of the young men on that trip, describes an ordinary morning, waking up, prepping the vessels, loading ice, getting a group of college friends onto the water. He says he rowed out with Bart because Bart's boat was the one absorbing the overflow. Then, in the same account, he mentions where his own belongings were, on the Palm Beach. Follow that. If his gear was on one boat and he was on another, then somebody else ran the Palm Beach that day. Somebody drove it out, somebody drove it back, and in every public telling of this story, that person has never been named. Not by the friend group, not by their attorney, not by investigators. A vessel involved in the last day of Nolan Wells's life has an operator the public cannot identify. Then there is the passenger arithmetic. Warren describes Bart agreeing, on short notice, to take on somewhere between 10 and 16 extra people, after Bart's father decided at the last minute not to come. Bart was 18, but this trip, by the same account, had been planned for weeks. So where were those 10 to 16 people supposed to be? A plan that matured does not leave a dozen bodies without a boat until the morning of. Either the planning was looser than described, or the seating arrangement changed, for a reason nobody has explained. And the difference between those two is not trivial when the entire case depends on knowing who was on which hull and when. And then there is the propeller. Photographic analysis circulating around this case has flagged a partially visible black propeller in at least one image, positioned away from the three identified vessels, carrying no name and no stripe pattern matching any of them. Be careful here, because this is where this case has repeatedly gone off a cliff. A propeller in a photograph is a propeller in a photograph. It does not establish a fourth boat. It does not establish who was aboard one. It does not establish any connection to Nolan whatsoever. Anyone telling you otherwise is selling certainty they do not have. But there is a version of this where a marine investigator resolves that image in an afternoon. Registration records, hull identification, dock logs, a single phone call to the marina. Months later, it remains open, none of which touches the discrepancy that does not depend on interpretation at all, because it was not spoken by anyone. It was recorded by a machine. Here is the return trip, as told. Water had gotten into the hull. To force it out, the group ran hard, roughly 40 to 42 miles an hour, driving the boat fast enough to push the flooding back through the drains. They came into a waterway called Fort Bayou. They stopped briefly so a friend could replace a drain plug. Then they carried on and docked for the night. One stop, mechanical. 2 minutes of a story that takes 10 seconds to tell. Now here is what the GPS associated with the vessel reportedly recorded. 5:44. The boat arrives at a location on El Camino Road. 8 minutes later, it leaves, heading east into Fort Bayou. That fits. That is the plug. 6 minutes after that, it comes back to El Camino Road, and then it stops. For 30 minutes. No movement, no explanation. Nothing in Warren's account, nothing in any statement issued by anyone connected to that boat, addresses what occurred in that half hour. It sits in the data between a 6-minute mechanical detour and the long run onward towards St. Martin Bayou, a bridge, and finally the launch where the boat was tied up for the night. 30 minutes is not a rounding error. It is not the kind of thing that dissolves out of a memory when the rest of the evening has been described down to the drain plug. It is longer than the entire Fort Bayou trip that was remembered. It is long enough to load something, long enough to move something, long enough to have a conversation that decides how the next several months will be described. It is also long enough to sit on a boat after a bad day and say nothing at all. That is the honest range, and the caveat has to be stated plainly. GPS data is not self-authenticating. The timestamps require verification against the recording device. The identity of the unit generating that log must be confirmed. The chain connecting that unit to that specific hull on that specific evening has to be established before any of it is worth a single sentence in court. A gap between a spoken account and a machine log is a reason to investigate. It is not proof that anyone lied. But it is not nothing, and it has not been resolved, and it has been sitting there in plain view the entire time. If you want this case documented properly instead of shouted about, subscribe. This next part is the one everyone gets wrong, because there was a camera at the dock where that boat finally tied up. The residence where the boat was docked that night has security cameras, documented, functional. There is footage of the group leaving that morning. Nolan is in it. There is no footage of the return. Consider what that missing recording would have settled. Not a theory, a head count. Who stepped off the boat, at what hour, in what condition, and whether an 18-year-old who left that dock in the morning came back to it at night. One clip, 30 seconds long, and half of this case evaporates. Give the innocent explanations their full weight, because they are not weak. Most consumer systems record on a loop and overwrite themselves within days, and nobody thinks to pull footage until the window has already closed. Cameras cover the angles their owner cared about, which is usually a front door, not a water line. Systems drop offline after a power flicker and stay dark for weeks before anyone notices the light is out. Hard drives fail, subscriptions lapse. Any of that could be true here. Possibly all of it. But that is precisely the point. Somebody should be able to say which one. An investigation operating at the standard this case demands should be able to state, on the record, what the system recorded, what it retained, when it stopped, and why. That is not an accusation aimed at anyone. It is a records request and a technician. Ambiguity is what has been fueling this case from the beginning. Every unanswered procedural question gets filled in by strangers with editing software and a theory, and by the time an official explanation arrives, nobody believes it anymore. That vacuum is where the next part of this story grew, and it is the part where the people investigating this case, online and on air, have done the most damage to their own credibility. This section requires more discipline than anything else in this case, and most of the coverage has not shown it. There are documented claims tying the family whose property served as the docking point to a multi-generational political history in Mississippi, running back to a former governor whose administration drew years of corruption allegations and who publicly backed segregationist policy during his time in office. There are separate documented claims about an attorney connected to one of the families involved, tracing a career through prominent conservative advocacy organizations, groups funded in part by donors whose money has moved through other well-known political operations. Those associations are real. What people are doing with them is not analysis. A political lineage does not establish corruption. Having worked at an advocacy organization does not make someone a criminal decades later. A relative who served a controversial governor 2 generations back does not transmit influence down a bloodline like an heirloom. Proximity to a wealthy donor does not give that donor operational control over how a county sheriff's department handles a death investigation. Every one of those steps requires independent documentation, and none of it has been produced. Political genealogy is context. Treating it as evidence is how a legitimate case gets discredited, and it has already begun to happen. Every hour spent charting family trees on a whiteboard is an hour not spent on the 30-minute gap, which is a documented discrepancy with a verifiable answer sitting in a device log. And now the counterweight, because the analysis fails without it. None of that makes these relationships irrelevant. The question was never whether someone in Jackson County is politically connected. In a county that size, everyone is connected to someone. The question is whether any of those connections demonstrably shaped a decision in this specific investigation. Whether a case was assigned differently, whether a warrant was delayed, whether a call was made that would not have been made for a family without that surname. That question has an answer, and the answer lives in records. Appointment logs. Communications obtained through legitimate process. Financial disclosures, case management timelines, sworn testimony. It does not live in a birthday photograph, an old employment history, or a screenshot of somebody's grandfather. Do the work properly, And the connections either mean nothing, which can be demonstrated, or they mean something, which can be proven. But there is a reason a mother in Mississippi looked at those names and did not assume the best. Say it plainly. A black teenager went out on the water with a group of white friends. They came back to their families. He came back in a body bag. And this is unfolding in a state with a long, documented, undisputed history of investigations involving black victims moving more slowly, with less pressure, and with less institutional appetite for hard questions than cases with white victims. That history proves nothing about this investigation. It cannot. Precedent is not evidence, and no one should be convicted by geography. But it is the entire reason a mother looks at a 30-minute gap, a missing camera feed, an unnamed boat operator, and a forensic examination that has not happened, and concludes that her son is not being handled with the same urgency someone else's son would receive. That is not paranoia. That is a woman applying the documented record of her own state to her own child. She is not asking for special treatment. She is asking whether she is getting the standard one. This case has been sorted into camps, and every camp arrived with its verdict already written. Team family, team friends, team sheriff, team cover-up, team tragic accident. Each one processes every new detail as confirmation of what it believed before the detail existed. Nobody is being persuaded. Everyone is being reinforced. Strip the teams out and look at what the parties actually need, because it is the same thing. The family needs answers that survive scrutiny, not reassurance from a podium. The young men on that island need a real investigation, because a fair process is the only thing that can clear a name once the internet has decided otherwise, and no amount of legal statement will do it for them. Investigators need evidence that was preserved properly, because a device handled carelessly is a device a defense attorney destroys in front of a jury, and the public needs a record instead of a performance. Not one of those interests conflicts with another. A single properly conducted, jointly supervised forensic examination serves all four at once. That is the strangest fact in this entire case. The thing everyone is fighting over is the thing that would help everyone fighting. And here is the possibility: almost no one covering this will say out loud, there may be no conspiracy at all, no cover-up running to a governor's mansion, no donor network reaching into a sheriff's department, no fourth boat concealing a crime. It is entirely possible that what happened to Nolan Wells is exactly as devastating and considerably less elaborate than the version circulating online, and that the gaps in this timeline are what gaps usually are, which is people remembering a chaotic day badly. That outcome deserves the same rigor as any other. So does its opposite. If something was concealed, it has to be established by records and extractions and authenticated data, not by propeller shapes in a grainy photograph, which returns everything to the same object it started with, and the questions nobody has answered. Where is Nolan Wells's phone tonight? Has a complete forensic examination been performed on it? If so, by whom, and under whose supervision? Was a forensic image created before anyone powered it on? Was the chain of custody documented well enough to survive a courtroom? Were deleted artifacts recovered using tools capable of recovering them? Was the associated cloud data preserved alongside the physical device, or was it allowed to age out while the lawyers talked? Until those have documented answers, this investigation is not inconclusive. It is unfinished. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He got on a boat with people he trusted, on a day that was supposed to be one of the good ones. He does not need a team. He needs a record.